og velkommen. Sorry, we have to do this in English. Welcome to this second half of presentations from our Greenlandic Perspectives Survey that we conducted this summer. My name is Allan Olsen. Just for the ones of you who did not participate in the first presentation, and I work for Greenland Perspective, the Greenland Perspective Initiative that is based here at this university, and works towards anchoring science and activating research into the society of Greenland. We have really looked forward to today to present for you the results from our survey, and we find it really interesting because it gives us an insight into the feelings and perceptions of the Greenlandic population on various topics that are important for Greenland now and in the future. It's also important for us to stress that this is a presentation of data and not our own personal views or opinions. This next presentation, as I said, is the second of two presentations, and it's focused on the perceptions of economy and politics in Greenland. And I'll pass on the word now to Gustav, who has led the efforts in this part of the project, which is financed by Kraks Fond Byforskning. Gustav is a PhD student at Copenhagen University Department of Economics. Yes. Gustav, please.
Thank you so much, Allan, and thanks to the University of Greenland for having us. As Allan said, I'm going to lead you through some of the results from the political part. We have a lot of items, but today we're going to focus on a few of them. My name is Gustav, and I was part of this broader team that we call the Greenlandic Perspectives research team. And we're researchers from all across the world. We represent the US, Greenland, Denmark, and I'm from Sweden. So as has already been mentioned, the project is the baby of a joint collaboration between these different institutions: the University of Greenland, the University of Copenhagen, Kraks Fond Byforskning, and Greenland Perspectives. It would never have happened without such a grand support by so many actors, and we're forever grateful for that. So now we zoom in on the political aspect of the survey. Did I get it up? No. And we're going to have two parts of this presentation. We have the political dimensioning of the political landscape in Greenland, and we have a grander focus on the questions of independence. Okay. So, the reason we see this as very important is quite simple. So, throughout the world today, a lot of decision makers base their decisions on gut feeling and not on facts. I guess I don't have to give you examples of that, but we could think of perhaps the president of an important nation. We see this in a lot of parts and on a lot of levels in society. And in Greenland, we have a lack of data on what the voters, the respondents to our survey, what they actually think. So when we collected this data, we did that for multiple purposes. We hope to be able to inform decision makers. We hope to be able to explore previously unexplored questions in Greenland. And we hope to inspire research here at the University of Greenland. And I should say, before I start, I'm happy to take questions. during the presentation because I think it's quite nice if we can make this a conversation. If you have very long questions, we can also take them in the end. So I'm going to have some time for questions in the end for sure. So first I want to present myself. No, this doesn't work. Never mind. Okay, so this is me in the middle. No. Sorry, this is me. My name is Gustav, as I said before. I'm a PhD at the University of Copenhagen. And I'm affiliated to Greenland Perspective. Right now, I'm currently at the University of Chicago. And my field of research could be labeled political development economics. And it's basically, it looks into how economics influence politics and institutions, but also how politics and institutions impact on economic outcomes. I've also been a statistics teacher here at alle. I say that instead of trying to pronounce it. The whole word. And I'm a proud member of the Greenlandic Perspectives team and of this subgroup that we call the Team Southeast. So Team Southeast is what you see here. It's Navarana Davidson, which is also sitting there, and Nadine Kliman, who's not able to be here today. And we traveled Greenland together. I did the cooking, they did the hard work in the field, collecting the data. And we, in turn, were part of this bigger team, which is the Greenlandic Perspectives research team. And just to take you through all of them, you met Olungak before, during the presentation before lunch. We also have Hans-Peter, Bettina, and Kelton, who presented before lunch. And on the last row here, on the lowest row, we have Alan Peter Olsen, who's sitting there, our coordinator. And during this summer, when we did the actual field work, Alan basically carried us on his shoulders. We also have Minik Rosing, who's professor of the University of Copenhagen, and David Rey Lassen, who's also a professor at the University of Copenhagen. And they've contributed with a lot of great advice throughout the process. In turn, though, this research team is, of course, just part of a broader network. We've been very inspired by Birger Poppel and his research, especially with the Slike project, who's done a lot of surveying at grand scale before in the Arctic. I work together with Rasmus Leander, who's sitting there, who's a university professor here at the University of Greenland. Then we also have James Robinson, who's the professor I'm visiting at the University of Chicago, who's contributed with some advice for the political part of the survey. And Esther Bianco here, she's been part of designing some parts of the economic items that we've had. And she's going to be a collaborator with me in my research going forward. So, Kelton just ran you through thoroughly how we sampled this, but I see a few new faces here, so I should do a short recap. So this summer, we went to 13 different locations across Greenland. 11 of these locations were randomly selected. We purposefully selected 2 of them, that is Nuuk and Upernavik, to get a more thorough representation of the Greenlandic population. We later randomized individuals within these different locations, and got 13 locations, 606 respondents gave us their survey back. We're now trying to collect some more responses, and that will increase the response rate we had even further. But to lead you through what a randomized selection does, Kelton showed this with age. we can show this in terms of the political stances. So these are the election results of the general election in Greenland this spring. This is an opinion poll by HS Analyse, which was conducted before the election. As you see, there's some deviation between the opinion poll and HS Analyse's, and the general election results. This is the results that we got. So we actually do slightly better than HS Analyse on this, which is great, which is convincing. Yeah, please do. Yeah, nice to meet you.
The analysis was made 2 weeks before the election.
Yeah.
So what happens between the analysis and the election?
That's
In that,
it's a very good point.
you can't see if it actually has hit exactly right.
No.
14 days before the election, and then we have during the election period.
That's of course true. And what I wanted to get to.
Not like that, that's just.
Yeah, no. That's of course true, and what I wanted to get to with this is that you can never get the exact represent the total population perfectly, but what you can do is to get decently close to it. And I wanted to show this because I think it shows that we represent a broad part of the voter stances across Greenland, and I want you to keep that in mind when we go forward. So, some disclaimers always at place. When we do this surveying, we necessarily make some questions that are very complicated a little bit more simple. And that's necessary because you can't grasp all the dimensions of complex phenomena in survey questions. But that's also important to keep in mind, that some items might not tell you the whole truth. This presentation will be light in analysis. That's something I do more in the research going forward. But in this presentation, it's going to be a lot of numbers. And also, if I'm a little bit, if you don't get exactly what I'm saying, if I'm being, not very good at explaining it, please stop me, please ask me, and we're going to go through it more thoroughly. Lastly, as Alan said, and that's very important now, the project doesn't have any political views. We're a data collection project, and we only present the data today. All right. So, 3 political dimensions. I propose the following 3. This is not to say that these are the most relevant the necessarily most relevant political dimensions, but it's 3 important dimensions in Greenland. So we have the left-right dimension of politics, which is commonly talked about elsewhere. We have fishing policies, and with that we're going to specifically mean the opinions on the total size of, or on the size of the total allowable catch in Greenland. And we also look at attitudes toward independence. And this last one is quite complicated. We have a lot of items on it in the survey. And the reason we have that is partly because it's so interesting, but also because it's so complex. So we want to be able to show you that it's not that we can give you a definite answer on anything. It's a complex issue. Then we're going to map this into political dimension. We're also going to map it into geographic dimensions to look at how respondents of our survey place themselves into these dimensions. All right, so let's start with the left-right scale. Is it at all meaningful in Greenland? And here I want to make a clear distinction first. So, we have something that is actual politics. So if you think of tax policy in Greenland, redistribution, that's one side of the picture. Then you have the other side, which is voter perception. What we're going to look at is the second part. It's voter perception. And with actual politics, I'd say that some politics can always be divided into left and right. So raising the tax level from current stances would, for example, be a leftist thing to do. But this doesn't mean that voters deem it as an important dimension. It doesn't mean that they even think about it. So this latter point is something we're going to be able to look into with our data, and where I'm going to present some brief results today. I don't know if you know Quora. It's a website. It's one of these few places on the internet left where people ask serious questions and they get meaningful responses. So it's quite nice in that sense. So someone asked this: why is Greenland so left-wing? And a Greenlander responded that politics in Greenland has been shaped by Denmark. Even though Greenland is a self-governing country, the system is similar to Denmark's politics. And he adds, the Inuit in Greenland have the mentality to support the ones who are in need. And so let's look into what our data says when it comes to the left-right stances in the country. So we asked the question, in politics, people sometimes talk of left and right. Where would you place yourself from 0 to 10, where 0 means far left and 10 means far right? So intuitively, right is to the right, left is to the left, and what you see is a big hump on the neutral position. Actually, it's almost 50% to place themselves there. I want to add here that my view is that most people have understood this item. Some have not. But these who have not understood it could actually be hidden in this neutral position. But we have a big chunk of the Greenlandic voters, or the respondents of our survey, that consider themselves neutral when we ask them. Let's go forwards. Second dimension. Preference over the size of total allowable catches in Greenland. So the fishing industry is by far the most important industry in Greenland. It constitutes 90% of the exports and 30% of the GNI. But fishing is also a complex issue. If we fish more today, there might be less left for us tomorrow. It has an intertemporal dimension. And so clearly, as the fishing industry is so important in Greenland, and it has these dilemma features, it's also a very important political dimension. And to sort of show you that it's actually a political decision, the Natural Resource Institute here at the University of Greenland, they come with recommendations for how big the quota should be. But ultimately, it's a political decision what the quota should be for the coming year. And this is how how respondents place themselves when we ask them, do you think that the total allowable catch of fish in Greenland should decrease or increase? We can see that quite a big part of the respondents place themselves on the increased side of the graph. We have also a big one in every 3 Greenlanders who would keep it at the same level, and fewer people want to decrease the fishing quotas from the current level. Yes, please. Yeah. So very good question. It's exactly as it's phrased there. So it's not in relation to the advices. It's from how people perceive it today. So we with purpose, we keep a lot of these items without setting it in perspective. So the respondents themselves will set this perspective. Yes, please.
But then it could have been understood as if, do you want it to increase or do you want it to decrease?
The quotas?
Not the quotas, but the purpose.
Do you want it?
Could it be perceived as you asking the respondents if they want the issue to increase or decrease?
I would think not. I think people are familiar. So it's also, of course, it's in the context where we ask of a lot of preferences questions. So I think people perceive that there are quotas on fish, and that the question alludes to whether they want these quotas to increase, not fishing per se. But interesting point. So attitude towards independence. Again, this is very complex. We have a lot of items on this. But first, I want to say that it's a general consensus among the parties that eventual independence is what they strive for. The only exception is Samarbeidspartiet at the moment, where the Democrats are a little bit more hesitant on the question. However, there are big differences on the timing of independence. And also we know little about whether or not voters, respondents in our case, support the parties in this agenda. So it seems meaningful to add views on independence as a third stance. Okay, Greenland wants independence, just not right now. This is a headline from a recent article in the High North News. And I think this has been posed many times, but few have investigated when voters want independence then, or when parties want independence. So that's something we're able to look into with our data. But now I'm going to plot the following question, or responses to the following question, which is, how negative or positive are you towards complete independence of Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark within the next 10 years? And as you can see, the opinions are, they're almost distributed like a normal distribution. So as you're gonna see when we go forward, the views sort of change depending on how we ask this question. And this is just one way of plotting it. And going forward, I'm mainly going to use this yeah, I was not going to use that word. Yes, please.
I think you said it was almost a normal distribution, but I think it's interesting to see that at both ends, both negative and positive, it varies very much from what you expect if you have a normal distribution.
That's true. That's true. It's really not a normal distribution. Yeah. As Birger pointed out, we have quite a large of the part of the distribution in the tails. So that is very negative to the left and very positive to the right. Okay. So now we're gonna place the parties in these different dimensions, and we do that by averaging the voter stances for each of the parties in these dimensions. And I'm going to use a different definition of the word or on the stance of independence. And from now on, we're going to use this. So it's a fraction of votes in favor of independence. That's how I call it. And what it really is it's something that comes from this question. So it's, if there was a referendum on independence today, asking if you wanted Greenland to leave the Kingdom of Denmark, how would you vote? So we have these four alternatives, but if it was a real referendum today, then the two last options wouldn't matter, because you only count the yes and no. And something that's very important with this is that, so we don't know what the people, I don't know, would vote if they were actually forced to. So that's why it's a large margin of error when we use this this way of looking at independence or views on independence. But that's just to say that this is how we do it going forward. It's the share of yes votes as or share of the yes votes as part of the total votes for either yes or no. Okay? All right, so this is how it looks when we plot it by parties. And as you can see, and we're going to use this throughout, we have these big, what do we call it, like bands around the mean. And the bands is the margin of error. It's bigger for the small parties because we have fewer respondents from the small parties. So on the y-axis, we have fraction of votes in favor of independence. And as you can see, the party with which least favors independence, it's SA. On the another party that is where you have a big share of voters against independence, it's the Democrats. On the other end of the spectrum, we have, let's go back there. What happens there? Perfect. We have partierne and Siumut, where respondents from these parties in general are more positive to independence. Okay. Okay, so we now look at how voters from each party place themselves on the left-right dimension. We could, of course, focus on differences here. We could, for example, say that EA is a little bit more to the left than most other parties, given their story coming from a socialist ideological foundation. It's not very surprising, but I think what's more striking here are the similarities. So if you take the margin of error into consideration, we can't distinguish most parties. And that is, of course, because we had so many neutral voters, and so many neutral voters from all of the parties. So that's important to keep in mind when we go forward. And that's also to say that this dimension seems to be less important for voters in Greenland, at least given the way we asked the question. Okay, so the Democrats are a little bit more to the right compared to EA. We can see that, but it's a small difference. Let's move to the next item. So opinions on the future size of total allowable catch by parties. I think the only thing I would point out with this, it's not very surprising, the results here. I think Samarbeidspartiet stand out as the party least in favoring of increasing the total allowable catch. But I would probably keep it to that. So it's a bit slow, the response here. Okay. So this is something beautiful we can do with our data now, which hasn't been possible for researchers before. To the left, you see a plotting of the parties on a left-right scale, and that's again it's left to right, and then you have the identity dimension in the axis, in the y-axis. So you have. He called it identity and hybridity, but really what it is sort of more nationalistic, more favoring independence, are further up, and more favoring the staying in the Kingdom of Denmark, or hybridity as he calls it, are lower down. And what we can see, and this is from the Twitter account of Ulrik Pram-Gad, it's based on his gut feeling. And we can also compare it and contrast it to how voters in our survey place themselves in these dimensions. And I have to say, we can sort of praise him for his gut feeling, because the way he plots the parties into these two dimensions is quite similar to how the voters of these parties actually consider themselves. Again, these are averages, so we should take them for averages and only that. We now plot the parties into two other dimensions. We have attitudes to mining in the x-axis, and we have attitudes or positions, views on the size of TAC on the y-axis. So further to the right means more positive to mining, and further upwards means more in favor of increasing the size of total allowable catch. Here I want to point out that the views or the positions on the future size of TAC seem to be more pronounced in terms of party differences compared to attitudes on mining. So the size of TAC seems to be perhaps a more important dimension for Greenlandic voters. We again have a big difference here between Nunata Kitonai, I was not going to try to pronounce that either, and Samarbetspartiet. Another interesting way of plotting the parties is, of course, looking at the trust in the government, and then with that we mean the Danish government and the Greenlandic government. So on the x-axis we have trust in the Danish government. Higher numbers are more trusting. On the y-axis we have trust in the Greenlandic government. Higher numbers also means more trusting. Can you guess which parties were in the government when we did the survey? Yes, you can. It was these. And they are also the most, so the voters of these parties have the most faith in the Greenlandic government. It'd be interesting to see if this differs now, since Partierne alle dropped out of the government. We also see, with very little surprise, that Samarbetspartiet is the party that is more trusting in the Danish government. So let's plot this into some environmental policies, connecting it a little bit to Kelton's talk before. These are two dimensions which are important in Greenland. We have fraction of respondents in favor of increasing gasoline taxes on the x-axis. We have fraction of respondents in favor of banning oil drilling in Greenland on the y-axis. So again, more to the right and higher up is more in favor of both of increasing gasoline taxes and banning oil drilling. We see that it's quite an important positioning in both dimensions, where Inuit, EA, I'm just going to keep the abbreviations, EA, which has been focusing a little bit more on some of the environmental dimensions of Greenlandic politics. They are also one of two parties which respondents are positive to increasing gasoline taxes and of banning oil drilling in Greenland. So let's break this dimensioning up into two sort of background characteristics that predict voting behavior. We're going to look at town versus settlement, and the reason we do that is that the urban-rural dimension is important elsewhere. It's likely to be important in Greenland, maybe more so even in Greenland, because of the very wide or important role sort of the local community here in Greenland. We're also going to break it up by perceived relative income. And income is an important predictor of political behavior in all contexts. It's likely to be important also in Greenland, but that's something we can look into with our data. So when we do this, we do it in this way. So here we plot the perceived income level. That is how rich you think that your household is in comparison to other households. And so that's on the x-axis. On the y-axis here, we have fraction of votes in favoring independence. Okay? So we split them up by settlement and town. I'm colorblind, so I'm not going to refer to the color, but I'm going to call it darker and lighter. So settlements are the darker colors here. We can see that respondents from settlements in general are a little bit more positive to independence. We don't have a strong relationship to perceived income level, but if anything, it seems to be a slightly negative relationship. So the richer you are, the more negative you are to independence in the near future. Okay? Let's move on. So who's left and who's right according to these dimensions? Here we would expect that richer people are a little bit more to the right, and right here is defined as being higher up in this graph. Okay? It's not a very strong relationship, but you see somewhat that richer respondents or respondents who perceive their families to be somewhat richer also are a little bit more right-wing. We don't have a difference between settlement and town when we break it up like this. Lastly, who wants to increase the size of TAC, total allowable catch, when we split it up by settlement and town? So what's interesting here is that we have a positive relationship between income and preference for an increased TAC when you look at settlements, and you have a negative relationship between income and preference for TAC if you look at the town level. It's sort of it could possibly make sense thinking about the occupations in settlements and towns, but that's just that's speculation, nothing else. All right, we can also plot this into real maps, geographic maps. This is the left-right scale, and darker colors means more right, lighter colors means more left. And we can see that Ilulissat, where you have more voters for the Democrats, consider themselves a little bit more to the right of the spectra. Again, these differences are very small. Whereas in the south, where Simut are big, you have more voters considering themselves to the left of the spectra. Again, differences very small. Let's look at this split or into the opinion on the size of the size of TAC. Here, I think the more marked difference is between settlements and town. So all of the places where you have the biggest support for an increase of the TAC are settlements. And lastly, if we look at share of votes for independence, you see a somewhat similar pattern that the support for independence is somewhat bigger in settlements compared to towns. We have the least, in terms of localities now, the least support for independence from Ilulissat and Nuuk. All right. What we're going to do now is we're zooming in on the independence question. And we're going to do that by asking when the respondents want independence, if they want it. And then we're going to look at who wants it. So we're going to look more closely into subgroups and how they would vote in a hypothetical referendum. So we do this first by asking this question: what year do you think that Greenland should become independent? And when I plot that up, let's make it bigger. I want to say that here we only look at respondents who want independence this century. We also had respondents who wanted it in year 3000. But if I would sort of allow for that, it would be a very big graph. So we only focus on respondents here who wanted this century, and we can do that a little bit more nicely when we look at a cumulative distribution of the population. So what's going to come up here is a line. The line shows you on the y-axis the share of respondents who want independence for that year or earlier. Okay? So we're going to plot it and see basically how the share of respondents who want independence increase over the century. And we have the median voter chooses 2037 as his or her response to this question, when do you want independence? We also see that we don't reach 100% in this century, and that's because some of the respondents, they don't want independence at all when we ask them. All right, so now we're going to look at the more direct questions when it relates to independence. So do you think that Greenland should become an independent country at some point in the future? It's quite a direct question. We see that 67%, so almost 7 out of 10, wants independence at some point in the future. 14.7%, they say no to this question, whereas 17% or 17.6%, they don't know. We also ask if there was a referendum on independence in 10 years, asking if you wanted Greenland to leave the Kingdom of Denmark, how would you vote? So in 10 years from now. So how would people vote? Here we see the yes votes. It's 45.7% would vote yes to independence if they were asked in 10 years from now. 21% say no. We also have an important, we have a large part to say they don't know, and that's important to stress that we have no way of knowing how these people would vote if they would really be forced to. But in our survey, the way we phrased it, they were allowed to say that they don't know how they would respond. Lastly, we ask how they would vote given that it was a referendum on independence today. So again, starting with the respondents for yes, we have 38.4% that would vote for yes. We have 32.8% that would vote no. 19% of the respondents say they don't know, and 9.8% of the populations would not vote. Okay. So as a last exercise here, I have no idea how I'm doing on time. Okay. We split this vote up in different subgroups. So first, we look into how respondents from towns, as opposed to respondents from settlements, would vote given they were asked. So we sort of have an indication from this, given what we looked at before, but here we have it more clearly. Respondents from settlements are more positive to independence, whereas respondents from towns, there you have half of the respondents saying yes as opposed to no. So residents of towns are less likely to vote in favor of independence than are residents of settlements. Something happening here? No. Oh yes, sorry. So then we ask the same question, we split up by high and low education, and we define this as having started or having obtained gymnasium, high school diploma, or not having started or not having achieved a high school diploma. And we see that respondents with higher education levels are more hesitant to independence compared to respondents of lower levels of education. We can also split this up by sort of the relation to Denmark. I define that here as having ever lived in Denmark. And we see that respondents who have never lived in Denmark, they are more in favor of independence, whereas respondents who indicate that they at some point have lived in Denmark, they are more negative, on the negative side to independence. Sort of sensible what we see here. Lastly, I want to look into this item, and now we link it very strongly to what Kelton talked about before. This is one of our items on climate policy. We asked them, do you think that climate change will make independence more difficult or easier? Most of the respondents take a neutral stance here. They don't think it will have an impact. But we also have some subgroups who say that it will make it more difficult, and some other respondents who say it will make it easier. So what I do now is to take the respondents who indicated that it's going to make it more difficult as one group, and I take the other group, the ones that indicate that it's going to make it more easier, as another group, and I look into how these groups are voting in a hypothetical referendum. What we see here is that voters or respondents who indicate that they think that climate change will benefit or help the prospect of independence, they are also more likely to vote in favor of independence. Whereas respondents who think that climate change is gonna make the prospect for independence more difficult, they are more negative. They're less likely to vote in favor of independence. So that's the last subgroup that we split it into. I also want to show you this. It's splitting the voters into two. So we have respondents who would vote yes and respondents who would vote no into two different groups in this histogram. And what we look at is how they perceive the economic impact of independence. So more to the right means that you think that independence would impact the economy of Greenland positively. It would benefit the economy. Whereas to the left, the negative and very negatively means that voters think that, or respondents here think that independence is going to harm the economy of Greenland. So what we see is that the two voter groups, they think completely different about how an independent Greenland would change economically as opposed to a Greenland that stays in the kingdom of Denmark. And this is something I will look more closely into going forward. This is part of my research interest in this survey. But now I want to sum up what we learned in this presentation. Let's make it in 3 points. Firstly, we've plotted a political positioning in 3 different dimensions. We see that the left-right dimensions, according to our data, is a little bit less meaningful to voters as opposed to stances on fishing policies and stances on independence. We have also seen that the views on independence is a complex phenomena. The response we get depends on how we ask the question, and I think that's very important to keep in mind. Lastly, we've seen that economic expectations is strongly correlated with the actual voting behavior, according to our data. We have a lot more that we could learn from the items we have in this survey. I have had a very short time to sort of choose in the parts we're going to look into, but both me and Kelton, we have a number of items that we consider very important as well. So for example, we have data on economic vulnerability, that's a difficult word. Trust in institutions, we have data on tax preferences and economic behavior, and we're very happy to be able to come back here and present more of this. And I also want to stretch that again, that if you're interested in learning more about this, please email me or Kelton. Please talk to us after the presentation, and please follow us when we come back here in spring. These are our emails, and now, you're not going to have more time to write them down. I'm happy to take questions.
So, any questions from any of you guys? Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, you said that depending on the way you ask the question, it would paint different pictures of the question about independence. I didn't really get that up there. I didn't see different...
Okay.
So, if you could just...
Yeah, so just to sort of show it in two ways that we could think that it perhaps gives a different view. So if we ask them when they would prefer independence, we see this picture that voters prefer independence in the future at some point. When we look at the percentages, if they would be forced to participate in a referendum, it looks a little bit different. So you have more, for example, if you would ask it in 10 years, you have here more respondents who would say yes to independence, as opposed to the no to independence. Again, you have a big part of the population who also says, I don't know, and I will not vote.
But why is that different from the picture you just showed before? Because that just said that the average would like it more in 37 than in any of the other years. That doesn't mean that 90% wanted in year 37.
No. So what I mean is that is perhaps it seems to be a little bit more negative views on independence right now, if that makes sense. And we can also go back to one of the first items. That's a long ride. Sorry for this. Are we there?
Yeah.
Next one. Here. So this one paints a picture which is perhaps more negative in comparison to when you ask, how would you vote? That's my view. But I think I would like to sort of... And I also think that's an important part of why we ask these different questions, because you definitely get different answers. We also asked, do you think that independence is important? And you get a completely, I don't present that here, but you get a different view, because you can think that independence is important without wanting it right now, for example.
No.
Any more questions?
Bjørn Poul, thank you for a great presentation. I wonder if there were so many people that declared themselves neutral in the left-right question. Did you have any support for people? Because one reason might be that the left-right as you also indicated, might be the case, didn't really work for Greenlandic voters. Did you have any more thorough explanation about left-right, or did you just plainly ask the question, where do you consider yourself, or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's something we talked a lot about when we designed the survey. We didn't. We asked it we asked it as neutrally as it is stated in the slides before. So the reason we did it like that is that if you introduce, say, tax into that question, then people might have a negative view on tax, and you could imagine a different. You would steer the voters in one direction or the other. I think. My view is that definitely there were some people who didn't fully understand the question, but the majority, I would say, we can also look into this by, for example, looking at how they place themselves into tax policy preferences. And there you see a coherent picture, but you also see some deviation from it, which is interesting in itself.
Hi, Anna-Sophie Skjævdal. Very interesting presentation, so thank you for that. I'm just wondering if you have any indications or an idea from your survey of how people perceive the concept of independence. Now you talk of economic independence and political autonomy, and are people in general able to divide those two concepts? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do understand
Okay.
the question. I'm just choosing my words. I think again, the way we phrase these questions, and Horse Analyse has done this in a different way, where they directly includes the economic consequences into the question. The way we phrase this was again to not prime them in one direction or the other, and I think that some people do take the economic consequences into mind when they respond. Some others don't. I have some possibilities to look into this more systematically, and that's also something I'll do with my research. But I'm not going to spoil that too much, I'm afraid. So please come to the presentation in the spring, and I'll give you a better answer.
My name is Maria Akren. So I'm associate professor here at del-resultater. I was wondering, have you asked the people on which party they are voting? You know, which party they favor in elections generally?
Yeah, we would have loved to have more questions on this. We only have the question how they voted in the last election. So this was sort of a space constraints debate that we had, where Rasmus was of course pushing me to include as many items as possible on politics. We had to make some choices, but I would have loved to have that data. We don't.
Okay.
Any more questions? Then thank you all for coming, and we're happy to talk more to you in person or via email. So please feel free to contact me or Kelton or Alan. And Alan, do you want the mic? Okay, thank you. Thank you all.